Another important symbolic interactionist theory, especially in reference to deviance, is labeling theory, essentially where people see how they are labeled and accept the label as being true. People behave the way they think someone with their label should behave. People, they're unconsciously noticing how others see or label them, and over time they internalize these labels and they begin to accept them as being the truth. Might not have started out that way, but by the end of it, that's exactly the way it feels. And then they begin to behave in accordance with the expectations that have been laid out in front of them. In this way, of course, deviance becomes a social construct. When you label individuals, that labeling can lead to those individuals acting out their labels. This is especially true when labels are anchored or confirmed among many agents of socialization. So, for example, if a child is labeled as a bad child by the parent, so you sit there and you tell your kid, you're a bad kid or you're a stupid kid, and then the school begins to say, you're a bad kid, you're a stupid kid, and then their friends begin to accept that they're a bad kid or not an intelligent kid, then all of a sudden that kid begins to accept that they are a bad or a stupid kid. And it may or it may not be true. But when the environment socially constructs you that way, and then you get these behavioral cues, these behavioral responses from others, you begin to accept it as true. Some other important symbolic interactionist concepts, primary deviance and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is the act of rule breaking, that first act of rule breaking, which may result in the rule breakers being labeled deviant, and thus influencing how people think and act toward him or her. Secondary deviance is acts of rule breaking that occur after that primary deviance and as a result of a person's new deviant label. So you, for example, let's say something happens in the household and something gets lost, and a child is blamed for losing it when they actually didn't, or stealing it when they actually didn't. This can result in a secondary act of deviance. And this secondary act of deviance is a result of how that person was labeled in the first place. They may have taken it, they may not have taken it, but there's a follow-up, and the follow-up is a pattern that is now going to start to take shape in reference to this person now being labeled as a deviant. Another important concept is stigma, or a negative social label that changes your behavior towards a person and also changes that person's self-concept and social identity. This has serious consequences in terms of the opportunities made available, or more likely not made available, to a group or to people in a stigmatized group. Stigma can be physical, moral, or tribal. For instance, a physical impairment might stigmatize or devalue a potential employee from a workplace. Something like a birth defect, or the fact that they are physically challenged, they're in a wheelchair. These things could devalue that person in the workforce. Or a moral stigma could include character flaws, for instance, talking too much, which could devalue a person's input in a group setting. A tribal stigma could be based on membership in a discredited group, such as a club or an organization that a person chooses to belong to, or a group that a person is born into, such as an ethnic or socioeconomic status. Just like deviance, stigmas will depend on the culture and context. If you're a Native American, you have a certain specific type of stigma laid upon you that's going to make it a lot harder for you to make it in this society than if you're a white person or an Asian person. Some more important theories: the broken window theory of deviance by Philip Zimbardo. This explains how social context and social cues affect the way individuals act. People who wouldn't exhibit a certain behavior in one social context might do so in another context where the behaviors seem more permissible. You have to ask yourself, do you think that people would be more likely to vandalize a car in a rundown neighborhood than in a gated community? This theory tells us that they would, but not because there are more criminals in that area. Instead, people might be more likely to vandalize a car because in that context, it looks like vandalism is more acceptable. But I would also add that in a gated community, it becomes a whole lot less likely for you to get away with vandalizing a car because gated communities tend to have security and security cameras and all that stuff as well. So it's not as simple as Zimbardo tries to make it out. Zimbardo is someone that we were first introduced to in chapter 2 with the Philip Zimbardo study, the Stanford Prison study in the human behavior experiments. And this is just him making his way in sociology and giving us some ways of thinking about where deviance actually comes from. We also, of course, when we're talking about crime and punishment, we need to talk about crime. Street crime refers to crime committed in public and often associated with violence, gangs, and poverty. White-collar crime, of course, committed by professionals against a corporation, agency, or other businesses. And corporate crime, a type of white-collar crime committed by the officers or executives of a company. Again, deviance is referring to the act or behavior that is simply different from what the majority group typically does. Thus, it generally receives a negative response. In the United States, eating your guinea pig would be considered deviant because most people don't do that. But in Peru, many people eat guinea pigs as part of a stable part of their diet, or it's a staple part of their diet. Eating or not eating guinea pigs isn't wrong, but depending on the culture that you're from, it can definitely be different from the group norm. Crime, however, is the kind of deviance that is so offensive to society that it has been codified into law. The punishment for this kind of deviance could include a state-backed sanction, making this a worse punishment than for something that is considered non-criminal but still deviant. So we have to remember it can be difficult to measure crime rates over time for a variety of reasons. So when we're thinking about crime, it's not real easy to get your hands around it. And some of the reasons are in changes in how crimes are defined. So how we define what a crime actually is changes over time. This is a socially negotiated, socially constructed set of parameters, and those parameters change over time. We pass new laws. Discrimination did not used to be a crime. Discrimination is a crime today. Overt racism, treating people as if they're subhuman. These used to be socially acceptable. Now they're not socially acceptable. There are fluctuations in whether people report crimes. This is a big problem in reference to sexual assault and rape. Up until just recently, and I'm not saying all women are coming out and reporting crimes, but up until just recently, most women are unlikely to report that they were sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, or raped. But now, all of a sudden, there's some fluctuations in whether people are going to report those crimes. We see day after day after day men losing their jobs right now because of inappropriate actions that they engaged in, and women are now feeling that they can publicly make comment about them and hold them accountable. That's a major fluctuation in how this has been dealt with in the past. In the case of murders, improvements in medical technology or forensics evidence and things like that has changed the way that we define what these are and how we discover whether someone has engaged in criminal acts. Something else we need to think about is crime reduction. When we're talking about crime reduction, we're talking about deterrence theory, which is a philosophy of criminal justice based on the notion that crime results from a rational calculation of its costs and benefits. According to the deterrence theory, stiffer penalties, increased prison terms, and stricter parole guidelines should help reduce crime. Unfortunately, crime is not reduced to its costs and benefits. In many respects, crimes are emotionally charged. They're not rational acts. So deterrence theory doesn't always understand the impacts and the reasons behind the crimes, and the idea that increased prison terms, stricter parole guidelines would help don't make as much sense if it's not simply based on a rational calculation of costs and benefits. Another important concept is, of course, recidivism. This occurs when a person who has been involved in the criminal justice system reverts to criminal behavior. There are numerous unintended consequences of deterrence theory that may ultimately result in increased recidivism. For instance, many critics argued that the first-time offenders who commit petty crimes actually learn more about criminal activity while they're incarcerated. Additionally, after incarceration, it is harder to find work since your record now shows that you've been convicted of a crime. This potentially makes crime a likely avenue since traditional employment is less available. While commitment to the total institution is supposed to help an individual learn and function as a productive member, it actually deters this for them in the long run. So since the 1970s, there's been a change in the United States from a more rehabilitative sense to a more punitive one. This is evidenced by historically high rates of incarceration, especially for African American males. Consequence of this mass incarceration includes staggering costs, the disenfranchisement of millions of former felons, and a disproportionately high rate of imprisonment for black males and Latino males, which is having a ripple effect throughout black communities and beyond. So the ultimate question is, does prison work better as punishment or rehab? Well, we have to ask ourselves, what's the role of prison? Is it punishment or rehabilitation? Does going to prison make offenders more likely or less likely to reoffend in the future? Well, research has shown that prison has very little effect on whether adults commit future crimes. For juveniles, time spent behind bars actually increases the likelihood of their reoffending, and these findings raise the question of why we spend so much money on incarceration. And it should be especially problematic as we watch the present administration ramp up its punitive processes after many years under the Obama administration, which was focusing more on rehabilitative justice.